Right now, your brain is actually capable of misinterpreting signals from your own body in a pretty major way. Like if you were to develop a dangerous infection or, say, an abscess right under your diaphragm, you wouldn't necessarily feel a sharp pain in your chest or your upper belly.
No. You'd likely feel this intense ache in your shoulder instead.
Which makes zero intuitive sense, right? Until you crack open the architectural blueprints of the human body and look at how the wiring was laid down before you were even born.
Exactly. The clinical presentation of a patient is, well, it's rarely just about what is broken in that exact moment. It is almost always a story about how the structure was built in the first place.
Yeah.
That referred pain to the shoulder. That happens because the sensory nerves for the diaphragm and the sensory nerves for the skin of the shoulder, they originate from the exact same segments of the spinal cord cervical levels C3 through C5.
Right, so the brain gets the signal and essentially misidentifies the source of the emergency.
Precisely.
Which means if you are a medical student, a young professional, or really just someone trying to understand this incredibly complex machine you live inside, memorizing a list of body parts is not going to cut it.
No, you have to understand the underlying logic of the design.
And that's our mission today. We are taking a deep dive into those blueprints, using the comprehensive anatomical and embryological data from the 2019 USMLE Step 1 lecture notes to figure out not just what the structures are, but why they fail the way they do.
And to really grasp those mechanical failures, we have to rewind to the cellular assembly line.
Way back.
Right. Long before there is a fully formed heart or a spinal cord, the embryo goes through an indifferent stage.
Meaning no gender yet.
Exactly. Between weeks 4 and 7 of development, you have this longitudinal structure called the urogenital ridge. At this point, the gonads have absolutely no specific male or female characteristics.
It's just a blank slate.
Basically, you have primordial germ cells migrating in alongside two distinct sets of ductwork, the mesonephric or Wolffian ducts and the paramesonephric or Mullerian ducts.
So it's essentially this neutral chassis sitting on the factory floor. The conveyor belts are running, but the factory is like waiting for a specific genetic software update to tell it what to actually manufacture.
That is a great analogy. And that software update hinges on a single piece of code, the SURI gene, located on the short arm of the Y chromosome.
Okay.
If that gene is present, it encodes testis determining factor, or TDF. TDF is the master switch. It triggers a cascade that forces that indifferent gonad to develop into a testis.
And once that switch is flipped, the factory starts producing some very aggressive chemical signals, right, to ensure the rest of the body follows suit.
It has to, because it needs to actively dismantle the other set of ductwork. So the Sertoli cells in the developing testes begin to secrete Mullerian inhibiting factor.
Which, just like it sounds, actively breaks down those paramesonephric ducts so a female reproductive tract does not develop.
Exactly. At the same time, the Leydig cells ramp up testosterone production, which drives those Wolffian ducts to differentiate into the male genital system.
So intuitively, if that spur gene isn't there, the factory just defaults to female. But, I mean, it's not a passive default, is it?
Not at all. In the absence of the Spurchi gene, you actually need the WNT4 gene.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this directs the factory to a completely different active blueprint. Ovaries develop, and that entire process requires the presence of estrogen. It is a highly orchestrated divergence.
What I find mind-bending is how different the timelines become once those gonads are formed, specifically regarding gametogenesis, how we actually make the reproductive cells.
Like biological strategies are completely opposed, yeah.
Because for males, spermatogenesis is this continuous production line that fires up at puberty. But for females, the notes point out that all primary oocytes are formed by month 5 of fetal life.
Right. A female fetus carries all the primary oocytes she will ever have before she even takes her first breath.
That is wild to me.
And they don't just sit in a dormant vault either. They actually begin the process of cell division, meiosis, but then they hit the brakes.
Oh, right. They enter meiosis and get arrested in the prophase stage.
Specifically a substage called diplotin. They will remain frozen in that exact state of suspended animation for over a decade until puberty begins.
Which is a staggering amount of time to pause genetic division. They just hold that configuration until the monthly cycle kicks in, at which point one primary oocyte finally gets the green light to finish that first division.
Only to get arrested again in metaphase of meiosis II, waiting to see if fertilization happens.
Wow.
It highlights a profound biological prioritization. The female body heavily invests in protecting a finite, pre-established pool of genetic material, tightly regulating its release, whereas the male system focuses on continuous mass production later in life.
Now, while the gonads are figuring out their identity, the rest of the embryo is organizing into three foundational germ layers: the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm.
Correct.
So I understand the endoderm forms the inner linings, like our gut and lungs, and the mesoderm builds the heavy structural materials, bone, muscle, blood. But the ectoderm is puzzling. Well, how do our hair and nails originate from the exact same embryonic layer as the central nervous system?
Yeah. It all comes down to cellular communication and induction. The ectoderm initially covers the outside of the embryo. A large portion of it simply becomes the surface ectoderm, which gives rise to the epidermis, hair, and nails.
Okay.
But running right down the middle of the embryo, underneath that ectoderm, is a flexible rod of mesoderm called the notochord.
The structural precursor to our spine.
Yes. And that notochord sends out chemical signals to the ectoderm sitting directly above it, essentially instructing it to change its destiny.
So it's actively reprogramming it.
Exactly. That specific band of ectoderm thickens to become the neural plate, which folds into the neural tube. We call this specialized tissue the neuroectoderm.
So your brain and your fingernails share the same ancestral material, but the neuroectoderm received a very specific set of molecular instructions from the notochord to build the central nervous system instead.
That's it, exactly.
And as that neural tube zips closed, you get these little groups of cells pinching off the edges, right? The neural crest cells, which migrate all over the body to become peripheral nerves, parts of the heart, even the bones of your face.
It's an incredible migration.
But let's look at what happens to the notochord itself once the bony spine actually forms around the neural tube. We end up with 32 to 33 vertebrae, and sitting between them are the intervertebral discs. The notochord doesn't just vanish, does it?
No, it gets evolutionarily recycled. It becomes the nucleus pulposus.
Okay.
That is the gelatinous, water-rich core trapped inside the tough, fibrous outer ring of each intervertebral disc. It acts as a hydraulic shock absorber for the spine.
Which is brilliant until the shock absorber blows out. When someone suffers a herniated disc, it's that remnant of the notochord, the nucleus pulposus, rupturing through the fibrous ring.
Exactly right.
Now, if the spine is bearing the full downward weight of the human body, gravity would suggest the weakest point is straight back, right into the spinal cord. But disc herniations almost always happen backward and to the side posterolaterally. Why doesn't the disc just blow straight backward?
Because of a massive structural shield running the entire length of the spine, down the back of the vertebral bodies and sitting right inside the spinal canal, is the posterior longitudinal ligament.
Oh, so it's blocking it.
Yes, it is incredibly strong, and it covers the midline of the discs directly in front of the spinal cord. It acts like a physical barricade.
So when the disc is compressed and the nucleus pulposus tries to bulge straight back, it hits that ligament.
And the pressure then diverts to the path of least resistance, which is just lateral to that ligament. That forces the herniation to go posterolaterally, where it ends up impinging on the spinal nerve roots exiting the spine, rather than the spinal cord itself.
The anatomy completely dictates the pathology. The ligament saves the spinal cord but sacrifices the exiting nerve root.
A necessary trade-off. And speaking of protecting the spinal cord, we have the meninges wrapping it, the tough outer dura mater, the web-like arachnoid mater, and the pia mater plastered directly onto the neural tissue.
But the lengths of these structures are critical for anyone wielding a needle, right?
Absolutely. In an adult, the solid spinal cord finishes its growth early, terminating around the L1 or L2 vertebral level. However, the dural sac and the subarachnoid space, filled with cerebrospinal fluid, continue all the way down to the S2 vertebra.
Which is why a lumbar puncture is performed below L2, typically between L3 and L4.
Yes, you are navigating the needle into a pool of fluid where the lower spinal nerves are just hanging loosely. The cauda equina, the horse's tail.
And they naturally float out of the way of the needle, so you completely avoid the risk of jabbing the solid spinal cord. And to get in there, the patient has to curl up and flex their spine.
Flexing the spine opens up the interlaminar space. It literally pulls the bony spinous processes apart, giving the physician a clear, straight trajectory through the skin, the ligaments, and finally piercing the dura and arachnoid to sample that fluid.
So with the central pillar established, we have to look at the automatic wiring system running out of it, the autonomic nervous system.
Our body's autopilot for involuntary functions like heart rate and digestion.
Right.
The autonomic system relies on a two-neuron relay. You have a preganglionic neuron starting in the central nervous system, which reaches out and synapses with a postganglionic neuron in a peripheral ganglion. That second neuron then travels to the target organ.
But the two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic, are anatomically segregated. The sympathetic system, our fight-or-flight response, originates exclusively in the middle of the spinal cord, from T1 down to L2.
It's a thoracolumbar outflow.
Meanwhile, the parasympathetic system, the rest and digest branch, originates from the extremes, the brainstem via cranial nerves like the vagus nerve, and the very bottom of the spinal cord at levels S2 through S4, a craniosacral outflow.
This physical separation is vital for diagnosing neurological damage. Consider Horner's syndrome.
Okay, what happens there?
If a patient develops a tumor in the apex of their lung, it can compress the sympathetic nerve fibers traveling up the neck from that T1 level.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, by cutting off that sympathetic thoracolumbar input to the head, the parasympathetic system is suddenly running unopposed.
Which completely explains the classic symptoms. You see ipsilateral ptosis, a drooping eyelid on the affected side, because the sympathetic muscle keeping it wide open is paralyzed.
Spot on. You also see meiosis, a constricted pupil, because the parasympathetic constrictor muscles have no sympathetic dilator muscles fighting back.
And anhidrosis, a complete lack of sweating on that side of the face, because sweat glands rely entirely on sympathetic wiring. It's a perfect mechanical failure.
It really is. So let's follow those autonomic nerves down into the cavities they actually regulate, the thorax and the abdomen. The superior mediastinum, the space in the chest above the heart, requires absolute spatial awareness. It is incredibly dense real estate.
I always picture it as the utility shaft in a tiny high-rise apartment. The body just has to pack vital plumbing and electrical lines into one vertical column.
Exactly. And you have to think about it from front to back. Starting just behind the breastbone, you find the thymus, or its fatty remnants in adults. Right behind that are the massive right and left brachiocephalic veins carrying blood back to the heart.
And moving deeper, you hit the heavy arterial plumbing, the aortic arch. And the aorta is vulnerable here, right? The notes highlight corrugation of the aorta.
Yes, a congenital narrowing of the vessel.
Yeah.
It usually happens just past the point where the left subclavian artery branches off to supply the left arm.
Because the pipe is pinched tight at that exact location, blood pressure spikes in the upper body and plummets in the lower body.
Exactly. Directly posterior to the aortic arch is the trachea, the air tube. And finally, plastered against the vertebral bodies in the very back is the esophagus, the food tube.
Which brings us down to the floor of the thorax, the diaphragm. We already established it's wired to the C3, C4, and C5 spinal nerves, but its development dictates the safety of the entire chest cavity.
Right. Sometimes the pleuroperitoneal membrane fails to close completely during embryological development, usually on the left posterolateral side,
Creating a congenital diaphragmatic hernia. Because the barrier is breached, the developing organs in the abdomen, like the stomach and intestines, herniate upward into the thoracic cavity while the fetus is still growing.
And the consequence isn't just about organs being in the wrong place. The lungs simply don't have the physical space to expand and develop.
Resulting in pulmonary hypoplasia.
Exactly. The baby is born with severely underdeveloped lungs, which is a massive clinical emergency.
Stepping down through that diaphragm, we enter the abdomen. Radiologists often reference the transpyloric plane.
Yes, this is an imaginary horizontal slice through the body right at the L1 vertebral level. It serves as a sort of anatomical equator.
If you take an MRI slice right there, you hit the pylorus of the stomach, the neck of the pancreas, the vessels entering the kidneys, and the start of the superior mesenteric artery.
But the layout of the abdomen isn't just a vertical stack, it's a twisted labyrinth, all because of how the GI tract rotates during development.
I always find this fascinating.
The embryonic gut tube grows faster than the abdominal cavity can contain it. It herniates out, twists around the axis of the superior mesenteric artery, and then pulls back inside.
And that complex rotation is what creates the classic inverted U shape of the large intestine, placing the ascending colon on the right and descending colon on the left.
And that twisting creates hitting pockets. The peritoneum, the membrane wrapping all these organs, gets folded over on itself.
Forming the greater sac, which is the main abdominal cavity, and a smaller hidden pocket right behind the stomach called the lesser sac.
And there is only one tiny doorway connecting them, the epiploic foramen. Surgeons absolutely must know the exact door frame of the epiploic foramen.
Why is that so critical?
Because the anterior border of that doorway is the hepatoduodenal ligament. Wrapped inside that ligament is the portal triad, which includes the portal vein and the proper hepatic artery.
So if a surgeon needs to control massive bleeding from the liver, they can literally pinch that doorway shut to stop the blood flow.
Exactly. It's a lifesaver.
Dropping further down into the pelvis, gravity starts to play a huge role in the pathology. In males, the spermatic cord runs down through the inguinal canal.
Right.
Inside that cord is a network of veins called the pampiniform plexus. If the valves in those veins fail, blood pools, creating a varicocele, a dilated, tortuous mass of veins.
But because it's a gravity issue, a key diagnostic clue is that the swelling physically reduces when the patient lies flat.
The pelvis also houses the incredibly delicate plumbing of the urinary system.
Yes, the ureters run down from the kidneys, and they face multiple anatomical bottlenecks where kidney stones love to lodge. But for pelvic surgeons, particularly during gynecological procedures like a hysterectomy, the ureter poses a massive risk.
Because of how the organs descend and shift during development, the ureter ends up passing right underneath the uterine artery, just a centimeter or two away from the cervix.
Medical students memorize this with the phrase, water under the bridge.
Right. The ureter carries the water, passing physically under the bridge of the uterine artery.
And if a surgeon is tying off the uterine artery and isn't paying meticulous attention to that spatial relationship, they can accidentally ligate the ureter, completely backing up the kidney.
It is a devastating complication born entirely from anatomical proximity. Now, the core engine of the thorax and abdomen is secured, but human beings have to propel themselves through space. That introduces profound mechanical stress to the limbs.
The limbs are just an ongoing series of tight tunnels and vulnerable leverage points. Take the carpal tunnel in the wrist. It's a rigid box.
The floor is made of carpal bones, and the roof is a thick, unyielding band of connective tissue called the flexor retinaculum.
Through that tiny, rigid tunnel, the body packs 9 separate muscle tendons to flex your fingers, alongside exactly one nerve, the median nerve.
That is an architectural nightmare. If you type all day or do repetitive manual labor, those 9 tendons get inflamed and swell.
But the bony floor doesn't drop, and the retinaculum roof doesn't stretch.
The only structure that can give way is the soft median nerve. It gets crushed, causing carpal tunnel syndrome numbness and pain shooting through the thumb, index, and middle fingers.
And that's just compression. Direct trauma reveals other design flaws. If someone falls forward and throws their hands out to catch themselves, the impact travels right through the heel of the hand.
Sitting right there is a carpal bone called the hamate, which has a small bony hook projecting outward. The ulnar nerve runs right past that hook.
So if the impact fractures the hook of the hamate, the bone fragment acts like a knife, severing or damaging the ulnar nerve. Suddenly, the patient loses sensation in their pinky finger and severe weakness in the intrinsic muscles of their hand.
Ouch. In the lower limb, we see similar tight quarters in the femoral triangle, located just below the inguinal crease. To navigate this space, you have to know the exact arrangement of structures from lateral to medial.
The mnemonic navel is practically a medical rite of passage.
I love that one. Moving outside to inside, you find the femoral nerve, the femoral artery, the femoral vein, an empty space, and lymphatics.
But that empty space, the femoral canal, is a serious structural weakness.
Because it's an empty, distensible sheath right next to a major vein.
Exactly. Increased pressure in the abdomen can force a loop of intestine down into that empty canal, creating a femoral hernia. And because the opening is so rigid, the bowel can easily become strangulated, cutting off its own blood supply.
Speaking of cutting off blood supply, we need to dwell on the hip joint for a second. Hip fractures are incredibly common, especially in older populations.
Very common.
But a fracture specifically at the neck of the femur is uniquely devastating compared to breaking the neck of the humerus in your shoulder. Why is the hip so vulnerable to permanent tissue death?
It is a quirk of vascular engineering. You would expect the blood supply for the head of the femur to travel straight down the center of the bone.
Right.
But instead, the primary blood vessels branches from the medial femoral circumflex artery approach the femur from the outside, wrap around the base of the neck, and then travel upward, running closely along the outside of the femoral neck to finally supply the head.
Oh, wow. A retrograde supply line. The blood is traveling backward up the bone.
Exactly. When a patient fractures the neck of the femur, the jagged bone edges shear right through those vessels traveling up the surface.
The blood supply to the femoral head is instantly severed.
Because there is very little alternative blood flow, the bone cells simply die. It causes a vascular necrosis, leading to a total collapse of the joint.
The anatomy dictates the catastrophic failure.
It does. The lower limbs are constantly fighting physical forces. At the knee, the anterior cruciate ligament, or ACL, attaches to the front of the tibia and angles backwards to the femur.
Its entire purpose is to act as a tether, preventing the femur from sliding backward off the top of the shin bone during deceleration.
And down at the ankle, the most common injury in the world is an inversion sprain rolling the foot inward. Because of how the ligaments are draped around the lateral malleolus, the anterior talofibular ligament almost always takes the brunt of the force and tears first.
Every movement involves a calculated risk based on structural tolerance. Which brings us, finally, to the command center that processes all of this sensory and mechanical data.
Following the carotid arteries up into the head and neck, we encounter structures shaped by incredibly ancient embryology, the pharyngeal arches.
Right. During early development, the embryo has these paired ridges on its neck that look strikingly similar to the gill slits in a fish embryo.
And they give rise to our most defining human features. The first pharyngeal arch is wired by the trigeminal nerve and eventually forms the heavy machinery of the jaw, the muscles of mastication like the masseter.
And the second pharyngeal arch.
It's wired by the facial nerve, cranial nerve is seventh, and forms the delicate muscles of facial expression.
Inside the skull, wrapping the brain, we find the cranial meninges. And there is a glaring vascular vulnerability right on the side of the head.
The middle meningeal artery, it branches off the maxillary artery, threads its way up into the skull through a tiny hole called the foramen spinosum, and travels along the outer layer of the dura mater to supply it with blood.
The danger is that this artery runs directly underneath the region of the skull called the pterion, right around your temple.
Where several skull bones fuse together, the bone here is remarkably thin.
So a blunt force trauma to the side of the head can easily fracture the pterion, lacerating the middle meningeal artery underneath.
Because it's an artery under high pressure, the blood pumps out aggressively. It literally peels the dura mater off the inner surface of the skull, creating a rapidly expanding epidural hematoma.
The blood pools, crushes the brain tissue inward, and creates a life-threatening neurological emergency in a matter of hours.
Let's trace those neurological signals deeper into the brain. The cerebral hemispheres, which process our conscious movement and thought, develop from an embryonic vesicle called the telencephalon.
Okay.
When these hemispheres send motor signals down to command those muscles of facial expression we talked about, the wiring gets complicated. Medical students spend hours trying to differentiate an upper motor neuron lesion from a lower motor neuron lesion in the face.
The easiest way to visualize this is the dual power grid analogy. Imagine the muscles of your face are a city relying on electrical power from the brain. Evolution decided that the upper face, your forehead and eyes, is critical infrastructure. It needs backup generators.
So the upper face receives power lines from both the left and the right sides of the cerebral cortex.
Exactly. But the lower face is on a budget grid. It relies entirely on a single power line coming from the opposite side of the brain.
That architectural distinction is how you diagnose a stroke versus a peripheral nerve injury. If a patient suffers a stroke, an upper motor neuron lesion on the right side of their brain, the left lower face loses its only power source and becomes paralyzed.
However, the patient can still wrinkle their left forehead.
Because the left side of the brain is still sending backup power to the upper face.
But if a patient gets an infection or inflammation in the facial nerve itself after it has exited the brainstem, like in Bell's palsy, that's a lower motor neuron lesion.
You've cut the main trunk line carrying all the power to that side of the face. The entire side, both upper and lower, goes completely limp. The forehead is paralyzed along with the mouth.
To wrap up our journey through the central nervous system, we must acknowledge the limbic system, the ancient core, where memory and emotion are processed by structures like the hippocampus and the amygdala.
But there's a fascinating area in the midbrain called the periaqueductal gray.
This is essentially the brain's internal pharmacy, isn't it?
It is. The periaqueductal gray is dense with opioid receptors. When a human is under immense physical stress or trauma, this area activates and sends descending signals straight down the spinal cord.
It actively blocks pain signals from ever reaching the brain by inhibiting the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. The body literally shuts down its own pain perception so we can survive the immediate threat.
It is a perfect example of a system designed not just for structure, but for survival. We have covered the human blueprint from the cellular origin of the gonads to the pain modulation of the midbrain. Let's test how well these concepts synthesize.
Oh, an exercise. Let's do it.
Imagine a clinical scenario with two different patients. Patient A arrives in the ER with an epidural hematoma caused by a lacerated middle meningeal artery after taking a baseball to the temple.
Ouch, okay.
Patient B arrives at a spine clinic with agonizing back pain caused by a ruptured nucleus pulposus in their lumbar spine. Based on everything we've decoded today, what specific embryonic germ layer gave rise to the tissues causing the pathology in both of these patients?
Well, this requires tracing the adult failures back to the factory floor. Patient A has an arterial bleed. The cardiovascular system, including the blood itself and the blood vessels like the middle meningeal artery, is built by the mesoderm layer.
Correct.
Patient B has a herniated disc, specifically the nucleus pulposus. We know the nucleus pulposus is the evolutionary ghost of the notochord,
And the notochord is?
a solid rod of mesoderm. So despite one being a high-pressure head bleed and the other being a squishy spinal shock absorber, both structures trace their lineage directly back to the mesoderm.
Precisely connected, you nailed it.
Yeah.
And that leaves us with a profound reality to consider. Our adult bodies are not fresh, modern designs. They are living museums carrying the structural remnants of our deep evolutionary past. We have the ancient notochord hiding inside our spinal discs waiting to rupture, and pharyngeal arches that mirror the gills of fish now allowing us to smile and chew.
It's amazing when you put it like that.
As you move through your day, it makes you wonder what other anatomical ghosts of human evolution are hiding in plain sight within your own everyday aches, pains, and physical vulnerabilities.